And now I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. Bryan Hanson, ombuds person at the Graduate School at Virginia Tech. In addition to his role as ombuds, Dr. Hanson is an educator, mediator, facilitator, and leader in the field of conflict engagement. At Virginia Tech, he works with members of the graduate school community to manage conflict in a constructive way. His approach focuses on an understanding of the university system and of productive ways to communicate concerns related to conflict. I'm very excited to have Dr. Hanson kick off this discourse for us in the College of Science with his presentation on disrupting academic bullying, a conversation to understand why and how. Thanks very much, Dr. Hanson.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hughes. It's an absolute pleasure to be here today. This is a very important topic, and I already mentioned to you, but I want to give you accolades in front of your colleagues here. You did an impressive job of bringing together some leading thought experts in this arena, and I think it is wonderful to see this effort taking place at Northeastern University, because it really affects all of us that work in higher ed. And so this conversation today, disrupting academic bullying, this is something that I've been working with in my community here at Virginia Tech since I've been the ombuds person for the graduate school community about 5 years now. Prior to that, I was on faculty and the program administrator for a graduate program in conflict resolution for about 10 years, and really have been helping people work through conflict and difficult situations for, almost 20 years now. And this is one arena that is really tough. It's complex. People like to see it as black and white, right and wrong, but there's just so much more to that. And that's why I think these conversations are important. So, here is a list of intentions that we have for today's session. It is my hope this is just the beginning of deeper and more specific conversations you will have around disrupting academic bullying. As you see in the list, I hope to provide the foundation to help normalize those conversations. We will start by learning language that will allow us to gain a mutual understanding of this topic. We will discuss the attributes of higher ed that may create barriers to voicing concerns or addressing these situations appropriately. And we also, learn, what are some ways that we can disrupt academic bullying when it takes place. Now I'm going to start with this. When you see this word, what comes to mind? How would you define it? Or how do you feel it manifests in academic settings? And while you think that through, I'm going to open a poll, or ask Dr. Hughes to open a poll, to get a pulse of how many of you on this call have encountered academic bullying. So as it says here, using your own language or your own understanding of bullying, how many of you have observed bullying behaviors, been the target of bullying behaviors, neither A or B, or both A and B? All right, it looks like we have hit the number, so I'm going to share the results here. And as you can see here, it really affects all of us. Many of you have both observed and potentially been the target of bullying behaviors, and there's only a small number that have actually, not perceived bullying in their environment at this point. So, it is really important for us to think this through, because I think, like I said at the beginning, it does affect all of us. So let's go ahead and look at this. There we go. So in our work at VT, to help provide a common perception of what we feel captures the essence of academic bullying, we appreciated this definition put forth in an article by Kelly called "Preventing Bullying in the Academic Workplace." And there are three aspects of this definition that I think are important to help differentiate what may be considered bullying and other forms of hostile behavior. First, bullying behavior is characterized as intentional. One difficulty in addressing bullying is the behavior may be perceived as intentional by the target, but not by the aggressor. And we will address this disconnect later when we discuss how to identify the type of bully that may be experienced. Second, the repeated and hostile behaviors lead to the development of an intimidating or threatening environment. And the perceived vulnerabilities and power differentials one may experience within institutions of higher education can escalate the tension in this environment. And finally, immersion within this type of tense environment can lead to trauma that has a lasting psychological impact. And this impact can be devastating to the target of this behavior, but also extend out to others that may coexist within this environment. And you might feel that these hostile environments are discouraged through existing policies. And there are indeed formal policies and procedures that are common within institutions of higher ed. And Northeastern has policies meant to alleviate some specific actions that create hostile environments. And I took a look at the various policies and procedures that you have, and listed them here on this slide with the links to more details on these individual policies. And while these policies are critical to creating ethical, equitable, and inclusive environments, they are limited in addressing a wide array of behaviors that may compromise the experience of community members at Northeastern. They are, however, very important for creating guideposts as we start to engage in conversations around these behaviors and how we can support those that perceive they are targeted by certain behaviors. Let's take a minute now to turn to the attributes of higher education that can lead to environments where bullying behaviors can be overlooked, minimized, or dismissed. And take a look at this list of attributes that we find within higher ed environments that may influence the dynamics that we experience. The relational factors influencing the dynamics include anticipation and assumptions about what life in academia entails, and the perceived expectations that may go along with this environment. Power differentials exist throughout academia between the faculty and student, faculty and administration, among the ranks of faculty, staff and faculty, etc. Cultural differences as well also influence the relational dynamics and are naturally an attribute of higher education institutions that bring students and faculty from across the world. Fear of reprisal is another that leads many to tolerate concerning behaviors and dismiss these experiences as typical for the environment. There are also certain inherent institutional factors that influence the dynamics as well. These include a proliferation of disrespectful communication styles modeled throughout the higher ed experience of those that become leaders. There's a focus on the development of specialized knowledge that typically does not integrate leadership, mentoring, or even communication skills as part of the professional development pathway. And like any organizational context, there is a natural competition for the finite resources that exist, and that influences the dynamics significantly. So, thinking about these attributes of higher education, how do you feel the listed relational and institutional factors influence the interpersonal dynamics within higher ed? And I invite, throughout, I'm hoping that this can be kind of a conversation, a dialogue. So feel free during times where you have a question or thought or comment, feel free to utilize your mic, or of course, go to the chat and we'll try to incorporate that into the conversation as well. But yeah, thinking about this, what thoughts do you have? How do you feel like these attributes may influence how we respond to, certain behaviors that come up. Well, keep these on your mind as we go through the conversation today, and we can try to piece these together to kind of think, well, what is it that we can do to address these situations in the most constructive way, based on our understanding of some of these attributes that exist within higher ed. And as you see,
I do see a hand raised.
Oh, great. Dr. Mendel.
Bryan, thank you. I think it's a fantastic structure you've put together. And one thing I'd sort of like to put into the mix is the nature of hierarchy and ownership. And this is something I've been seeing in my environment. I've been thinking about it right down at granular level. So with our PhD students, and how some people perceive you can make a great group environment, but actually depending where you are in the hierarchy, you have some power. A junior lecturer, for example, may not perceive the power they have, but they may pull a group together and actually stand on other people's boundaries. So I think it's about boundaries, respect, and how you use your position in that hierarchy. And that, I think I've seen great group dynamics, and I've seen really destructive dynamics grow. Sometimes when people mean well, but feel that they can walk across other people's boundaries, where the individual may feel quite violated, or it can actually be weaponized. So that's something that I've sort of perceived through all of this. And again, do we own a PhD student's idea that they're generating in their mind? No, not really. But actually, for me, it's just a difference in experience. And so I tend to like to think of collaboration. But I know that certainly in my male-dominated field, I've seen behaviors that are very different to that.
I love that. I love what you're saying there. And I recognize that a lot in the conversations that I have, is this development of boundaries and how they overlap throughout our domain in higher, and just that difficulty with understanding, which boundaries are permeable and which ones are finite. And that causes a lot of stress and anxiety to, kind of address things. I hear that a lot from students, where boundaries are set by faculty members that kind of contradict what we provide as a general community. Like, you have more resources and you're open to talk to people, but they're reluctant because they feel like, well, no, my professor has set this boundary as the extent that I can share what I'm experiencing. So thank you for adding that. That's a wonderful contribution. So let's look at why is it important to address bullying now? On the last slide, we took a look at the factors that create a complex environment that may allow for academic bullying to take place. Why is it important that we work toward overcoming this complexity and aim to disrupt academic bullying? So I think what's listed here are, everybody could probably agree to. We want to promote civility, uphold those community standards and principles, ethical statements that we want to live by, because, doing so creates community, and that can increase productivity and decrease that absenteeism and disengagement. And, we want to look at ways that we can model constructive group dynamics so that overall we feel that there's a higher morale. Beyond the list that you see here, what are some further reasons to address academic bullying? And another question I have is, we looked at, some of the challenges and factors that allow these behaviors to take place, or make it difficult for us to address these behaviors openly. What are some steps we can take to overcome those challenges? And I think one way we can do that is what we're doing right here, is having conversation, trying to educate, raise awareness, So we can take that back and try to use that understanding to model more effective ways to engage and work within our community. I see Erin has her hand
Hi,
raised.
thanks. I think as we face the great resignation or the great staff turnover of 2021, 22, it's just becoming more and more apparent how important a positive work environment is to retaining and advancing staff people. So, those that aren't maybe naturally inclined to be viewing their coworkers with kindness could possibly be swayed by the more practical matters of having a functioning work group that doesn't have high turnover.
Yeah, I think we are seeing that people aren't tolerating toxic work environments anymore. And, the great resignation, I think a lot of that is due to the fact that people understand, they're not confined to their immediate surroundings as places they can work. Remote work, I think, is going to be here going forward. And we need to think, well, what does that mean for our work environments, and how can we ensure that we keep the talent that we have in our communities here and setting them up to be successful. Thank you for sharing. Well, one way we can start to overcome these factors, as I mentioned, is to develop a consistent language, to normalize these conversations, to raise awareness that this is something that we are paying attention to and wanting to address when situations arise. Like this slide right here represents language that we at Virginia Tech agreed to in this institution related to those directly involved and those that observe bullying behaviors or are approached by those who perceive themselves as targets. So very simply, I think this is pretty straightforward, but when it comes to those directly involved, we have the target, someone against whom mistreatment is directed. And as mentioned, the target may perceive this mistreatment based on the individual's experience. And, sometimes we might dismiss that, disregard that, or make excuses for that behavior. But the key here is if somebody perceives that they are experiencing behavior like this, we need to give that space and presence and do what we can not to just outwardly dismiss or disregard. Next, we have aggressor. And this is someone who repeatedly and consistently says or does something harmful or malicious to another person. And we felt that the term aggressor was a less defensive label than bully and allows for better conversations to uncover that gap that exists between perceptions and intentions. Next, we have the observers. And a passive bystander, someone who sees something happening and does not say or do anything. This is not atypical. It often represents the need to gain familiarity and comfort to appropriately observe and acknowledge what is being experienced. And by providing that comfort, we can create a culture that is more apt to create active bystanders or upstanders. So that is someone who speaks out on behalf of someone else or takes actions that are supportive of someone else. And the key here is support. This does not mean direct intervention at all times. There's situations where individuals may, it will not be appropriate to intervene in the moment. But, this support could merely be exhibited by reaching out to a target, acknowledging what you observed, and sharing an interest to support them through their experience. So moving on from that common language, which most people would probably identify quite readily, this slide presents language describing ways in which a target may experience bullying. And these bullets present forms of aggression that you may have observed or experienced within your institution. Take a minute to review the list, and as you read through the list describing forms of aggression, I ask, do any of you recognize them from experiences you may have encountered? And please go ahead and share your thoughts in the chat as I kind of describe these a little bit more. So we have, for example, indirect manipulative aggression. This is experienced third hand through the proliferation of rumors or indirect remarks about someone who is not there to defend themselves. It is also representative of actions that exclude individuals from group experiences, isolate individuals from others in the work group, purposefully not sharing critical information, or slow walking a response that may be seen as urgent by that individual. Covert insinuative aggression, some might call this gaslighting, is experienced firsthand through passive remarks, insinuating the deficiencies of an individual, repeatedly dismissing the experience or concerns of an individual, and or imitating someone in a way that can feel insulting. Rational appearing aggression is one form of bullying that we may see commonly in higher ed environments where there are clear power differentials. The hostile behaviors may be rationalized as learning opportunities important to the development of an individual. However, the result ends up compromising one's self-inclusion or capacity to contribute to the team. Finally, on this slide, we have relational aggression. This can also be a devastating form of bullying as it is directly intended to limit the ability of the target to build networks and foster relationships that could provide potential allies. And that is one of the biggest harms that people might feel from bullying behaviors is that isolation, that disconnect from those that can be supportive, because then they start to internalize these things and start to feel that maybe they are the ones that are bringing this on. And I just want to see, okay, so we have Carol has said, there's much to recognize here. It is rather shocking to see them all on one page. And yeah, I mean, these aggressions, I think we all can relate to them in some form or another and see, when, we might have observed or experienced this in the past. These two bullets describe ways that targets may be subjected to the bullying behaviors. These are also related to the power differentials that may exist and can be fostered by an aggressor due to the vulnerabilities others in the work group may be feeling. First, we have mobbing. Mobbing is the experience one has when others join in on the behaviors. This may be especially present in the behaviors that we described as covert insinuative aggression. The bully by proxy, that takes place as an extension of the aggressor's power by influencing other members of the group to carry forward the hostile behaviors. And this is also a good spot to acknowledge the concept of cyberbullying. Cyberbullying is a hot topic with the proliferation of social media. Rather than a unique form, I believe it is more of a method or channel for these forms of bullying to take place. It is important to recognize how the forms of bullying may arise within social media channels and how that can further increase the psychological damage of the target, especially with the high numbers that can be developed to mob a target via these channels. And I understand that this is an experience some may feel is difficult to address since it may involve individuals outside of your direct community. So you might not have the ability to, signal them out or even engage with them about the situations that's occurring. But, ultimately, it definitely can be a devastating to experience cyberbullying. And I do want to provide some certain strategies in this arena that might help alleviate your experience with cyberbullying or help others that may come to you if they express that this is happening to them. First, if you're experiencing cyberbullying, you need to document it. That's one of the nice things when these things happen online. We can screenshot, we can take documentation of what's taken place. Second, and this is very difficult, do not respond. That is key. That is what these aggressors are looking for, is to trigger an individual and are hoping for people to respond. And then finally, depending on the social media or how these behaviors are being subjected to the individual, secure your channel. So, shut it down so that it dies out, because, these types of behaviors, they are fueled by engagement. And if you just shut that off, it can allow that to die away quite readily. So, looking at this slide, we ask, how are the behaviors expressed by those that perceive themselves as targets? Here I am sharing behaviors expressed to me in my role by those that perceive they are targeted by bullies. I categorize these behaviors by linking the behaviors experienced with the vulnerabilities that may be triggered. I find this is helpful to engage in conversations that can start to recognize the best means for supporting the target. For example, if we identify the behaviors are targeting individuals' social ties, we can look at interventions that can help shore up and strengthen the social ties of that individual. So take a minute to kind of look through this. How do you see this approach of tying the behaviors experienced to the vulnerabilities that were triggered as helpful when determining appropriate interventions? And I'm sure as you read through this, you can probably identify with some of these behaviors as well, just like those forms of aggression, and can see, when you kind of dig past the behavior, the damage that some of these behaviors, which might be seen as just loose ways of engaging, can really start to affect the mindset of an individual. So hold on to those as well, and as we get towards the end, we can kind of bring this together and kind of, well, what can we do? And this leads to identifying the individuals that we see as aggressors. So understanding the types, forms, and behaviors that relate to a bullying experience is an important step in addressing these situations. A further distinction to help determine proper intervention is to identify if the aggressor is a predatory bully or if the aggressor exhibits bullying behaviors when triggered by certain dynamics. When we look at the categories that may help identify the type of bully we may be facing, the first two listed would fall under the more intentional side of the spectrum. We have the chronic bully that uses power to their advantage in nearly all interactions. We also have the opportunist bully that is very strategic about the behaviors they exhibit in certain situations. Both of these individuals require careful thought about how to approach interventions that may be most effective. Defensiveness and rationalization for their behaviors are likely to make direct confrontation a difficult endeavor. The next type of bully is one that I feel is likely the case in most situations. I'm a humanist and an optimist, so I like to believe that most people do not go out there intending to, be this type of thorn in somebody's side or detrimental to somebody else's well-being. But the accidental bully can provide that same level of trauma. So it's important to think, how can we address this? An accidental bully is an individual that may not intend the behaviors they exhibit to be hostile, but those on the receiving end perceive the behaviors as hostile and suffer from those consequences of those behaviors. Fortunately, dialogue and training may be an effective approach to addressing these behaviors and the individuals that are exhibiting these behaviors, because once they identify the gap between their intentions and the perceptions, they may more readily come to the table to think, well, what can we do to help get past the situation? The final category of bullying requires a much different conversation and approach. Those are those individuals that behave in hostile ways due to the use of substances that alter their consciousness. helping the aggressor in this situation recognize the impact certain behaviors are having on the community and providing a supportive environment to overcome the grip substances have on the individual can provide a foundation to overcome this situation.
Bryan, I just want to interrupt for a minute to say there's a question, there's a couple of comments, but also a question in the chat. The question is there a category for those who know they can get away with it because there's no recourse?
Yeah, I think that, you know, borders between the chronic and the opportunist. So those that have that idea of gamemanship and see like, well, you know, this is something that I can do and it's going to be helpful for me to exert my dominance, to, you know, get the resources that I want, to keep people from, you know, varying from what it is that I think needs to happen. And so I would kind of categorize those individuals as probably the more, you know, as related to the opportunist category.
And Aaron has another question.
No, it's more of a comment. Maybe a question. One thing that I've had some experience with trying to help them mitigate the situation is somebody that knows what they're doing, but means well. So it's not exactly accidental. So it's actually fairly common that we run into professors that think their students need to toughen up or whatever, like they need to be able to face the harsh realities of competition and kind of a Shark Tank kind of atmosphere. So they're doing the behavior intentionally, but maybe they just need to be shown how it's ineffective. But you know, that's very difficult to deal with. Is it's coming from like a good place in a way, but it's just totally not working.
Yeah, and I think that relates well to that rational appearing aggression, where sometimes people really believe that, like, it's a tough world out there, and if you're going to be successful, you need to be able to handle this type of abuse. And I hear that all the time. And you know, when one of the most common things, you know, I work with the graduate school community, is, you know, people come to my office and they say, well, I don't know if I shouldn't be complaining about this because I think this is just how graduate education is supposed to be. And, you know, then I say, wait a second, you know, there is no literature out there that I'm aware of that says that your ability to be a good researcher is enhanced by being able to endure, you know, aggressive and hostile behaviors. And unless I'm wrong about that, or if there's something I'm missing, I think that would probably hold true. And you know, but so many times that's just the assumption that people make when they are in these higher ed environments, or even as you mentioned, it even gets put out there, and sometimes, well, in the professional world, or however people like to explain that, like, people are going to be jerks, so you have to learn how to get past that and, you know, exert these behaviors yourself. And I just believe that that's a poor way to look at the world. And, you know, what we can do is just have these conversations where, you know, we can, you know, illustrate how that intention, you know, just does not hold through, and you know, really compromises the individuals that are subjected to those behaviors. But thank you for raising that, because yeah, when you were talking about that, it just resonated very well with me, with the conversations that I often have in my office.
I like to think it's dying out a little bit, but I'm not sure it is. Right?
No.
Like my advisor, I like whatever, I'm fine. But my advisor was always trying to make people cry and toughen people up and stuff. But he's like old school, right? You know, you think it would be getting better, but I do know certainly some younger professors that have a similar mindset.
Well, I think it goes to, you know, what I mentioned earlier in some of the inherent, you know, attributes of higher ed and how people rise in this world. You know, people rise up in academia typically because they're really good in their specialized area of knowledge. They're good at the research process. And so that allows them to secure grants to continue studying that, and they become, you know, important faculty members that then require the assistance of students and research assistants. Yet, throughout that whole development, there's no emphasis on leadership, mentoring, communication, management, yet they're expected to do so. So what happens? Well, in the lack of that depth of knowledge around those topics, we tend to grasp models that typically we've been exposed to. And then that model becomes the end all be all for how we're going to engage with others. And as we know, when working with people, one model is typically not effective for helping, especially in this area of mentoring, guiding, leading people in their own professional and academic development. One model is not going to be effective for all people. So I think that right there, that disconnect and is what leads to what you were just describing.
And Bryan, if I might just make a small intervention on Erin's really powerful point. I read a really interesting article recently called "Bullying is a Career Tool of the Mediocre Scientist" or something like that. And I think my observation in terms of it dying out, I don't think it dies out naturally, but I think one helpful thing is to look and see who is not in your profession, because they're the people who've quietly left because they've recognized the poor culture and they've said, this is not where I want to be. And so it's the people you lose. And so those professors who say you have to toughen up to be successful, I mean, I think Erin's right that they exist. They're still there. The younger generation are also sometimes perpetuating that because that's what they've learned from their professors. Yeah. But there are so many people just saying, actually, this isn't for me, I'm going to leave. So look to see who's not in the room. And then I think on top of that, there is, speaking to the younger members of our communities, and they're actually asking us to do things differently. That's not success for them. Actually, it's how you define success, and being success at those costs is not successful. So many of us now are looking and saying, well, actually, maybe we shouldn't hire from those labs because maybe those young people will bring those behaviors. So actually to those, aggressive professors, you're actually limiting the success of your young people by teaching them those behaviors.
Oh, I love that. It's a wonderful insight and so true. And it kind of brings to light that, that offhand comment I meant about literature that shows a tough environment creates better researchers. It's probably the reality is the opposite of that. How many good researchers are you losing because they don't want to subject themselves? They're smart enough to think this is not what I want to be subjected to. Timothy.
I just like to add to Professor Mundell's comment as well that I think it's absolutely true that a lot of young scientists are leaving academia because they see these patterns and they see no hope in moving forward. But I do think that there's two types of younger academics that have been through these types of labs, and one is the one that says, oh well, I went through it and therefore that's just how it should be, and I'm going to perpetuate that system. But then there's the other side who, and I think that this might be part of the problem, is that it takes quite a strong personality to say, well, I went through this, I witnessed bullying, I was bullied, and I don't want to do that. Yeah. I don't want to live in a system that perpetuates this, but I still want to be in that system, right? And so it's not that we're going to lose all young scientists because they don't want to be in that academic system, but there's going to be fewer that say, okay, without the training, I think, without these types of seminars, without the training to say, well, this system doesn't have to be like this, and I want to be part of the change.
And I love that, and that is the hope that we want to hold on to, and as leaders in academia, try to convince those folks that may be experiencing these to kind of see how they can utilize these experiences to help change culture. So I like that, Timothy. And there are many efforts to help raise awareness of this issue, and more data is starting to emerge to help us in this case. The slide here presents some great resources that I encourage you to explore, and you will likely be introduced to this work throughout the subsequent presentations within the series. As you can see, Mahmoudi is one of who I believe will be speaking with your community next week. He's one of the leading researchers, in this area, and he has this wonderful survey and a wealth of data that is shared here on this slide. And then there's also other great efforts that are taking place. The other resource that I listed here is an example from the University of Minnesota and their Student Conflict Resolution Center, which has been tracking these type of behaviors for about 15 years now. So they have probably one of the longest longitudinal studies, kind of looking at how these behaviors or what behaviors exist within their community and how they affect the individuals within their community. And, I'll just read a couple of qualitative statements from these that I feel, really kind of represent, exactly what we were just talking about. One stated, I have won my university's top PhD student award and have 10 papers published, 7 first author, and another 4 papers to be published within the next year, 2 to 3 first authors. I wanted to become a professor, but after the treatment and behavior of my PI and the department, I do not want to ever be involved with academia again. Another student here says, the amount of power faculty have over grad students in the sense that a single person can make or break our career is terrifying. And even if you report and get some kind of resolution, you still risk your reputation and ability to get good recommendations, not just from the faculty member, but from the department. And here's somebody that, is, beyond the student experience. Postdoc says the professors who are supposed to mentor graduate students, have too much power on students, and there are too little restrictions and effective ways of punishment on their misconduct from the university system. When recruiting new faculty members, there is lack of proper training on mentorship, research, and boundaries. Students are the most vulnerable victims when it comes to harassment, bullies, and power abuse. My harasser is still out there, and nobody knows what happened when I was working in his lab. I really hope the university could make a better, safer, more welcoming environment for every student. Meanwhile, I urge the university top administrators and policymakers to listen to the students' voice, improve the professorship tenure and funding evaluation process, and build a more effective harassment resolution system. And those qualitative comments are very, very powerful. And in the Mahmoudi study, which was just an open survey for anybody involved in academia, they received over 1,000 qualitative statements like that. I mean, it's absolutely amazing. When looking at the quantitative responses to the University of Minnesota survey, I felt the response to the question of what prevented you from reporting the harassment you experienced or observed further illustrates why it may be difficult to voice concerns when these behaviors are present. This data could indicate that while reports of these behaviors may be limited in our communities, those reported cases may not give a true sense of what individuals in our community may be experiencing. Therefore, it is essential to consider what we can do to provide opportunities to normalize conversations around bullying and hostile behaviors, and to provide appropriate channels and support structures for individuals experiencing these behaviors. Because as you see here, what prevented you from reporting the harassment, those that experienced it, over half of them felt that no one would be available to help them. The fear of retaliation is strong. For observers, I found it interesting that, they may have seen bullying or harassment take place, but did not feel it was their place, or maybe did not have the appropriate tools, making it easy to feel like it wasn't their place to address these behaviors or to help support the individual.
Bryan, I want to note that Hazel has her hand up.
Oh, yes, thank you.
Thanks, Randall. And thanks, Bryan. This is really a fantastic presentation and discussion that you're leading. You know, I was one of the people at the beginning who answered A and B when you asked, had I been bullied and had I observed bullying? And I want, you know, the community to know that, you know, even when you get to be dean, there's a landscape that you've been exposed to. And it's not, you know, it's everywhere. It's everyone. We could have a long conversation about what I've seen and what I've been exposed to. This is bullying behavior is so pervasive and so damaging. And that makes this conversation unbelievably important. At the same time, I wonder, Bryan, if you could comment on the way to move people who are doing the bullying into a new place. Yes. Sometimes I think there's a bunch of inadvertent behavior. It really comes across as bullying. And sometimes, you know, there are people who become faculty or get into positions of power that are truly acting in a bullying way, knowing this. And sometimes I think there are people who are just clueless about how they're interacting. And I wonder if you could comment on this, because across our College of Science, we have been building community. We have as our metric a culture of respect, action towards equity. We've used the epithet kind, calm, and creative throughout the pandemic and beyond. And, you know, we need to make good on that. We need to make it real for everyone. And so how do we move people who are the bullies, are doing bullying, either who know it or who are inadvertently doing this? Do you have some things that you could share? I know that's a really big question, but it's one that is on my mind very much.
Yeah, and I thank you, one, for sharing your experience, showing how it affects, you know, people at all levels of our organizational hierarchies. But you also really led very well into this next slide. So the restorative versus punitive approaches to addressing these situations. And I will recognize first and foremost, when people first come and they're talking about these experiences they have, their mindset is on punitive, formal approaches to address these behaviors. And I understand where they're coming from, because they feel hurt. They feel compromised. They feel like they need to get justice and that this is their opportunity to do so. However, you know, and I'm not saying that formal punitive processes don't have a place, but we need to think, how does that affect the individual that is exhibiting these behaviors? Number one, it's going to set them up in a defensive posture. So they're going to go to the rationalization, justification of what their behavior is based on their intentions, and they're going to shut out the perceptions of other people as just their issues, typically. So what can we do to shift that intention or shift that approach from the desire of punitive formal procedures to one that's more restorative in nature, one that is you know, based on a philosophy that looks at engaging in dialogue, allowing people to open up their perceptions of the way that the relational dynamics are taking place and how they are contributing to these dynamics and how it really impacts not only the person that perceives themselves as the target, but how that might impact the individual that, you know, is seen as the aggressor. And, you know, that's where, you know, I really appreciate the restorative practice approach to these types of situations, because they really focus on repairing damage to relationships over assigning blame and dispensing punishment. And if we can do this, you know, we really can start to create a culture where, you know, community members feel open, feel available to look out for each other, support each other, and speak up if someone is being bullied. And what does that look like? Well, it really looks like one, hearing rather than dismissing or disregarding the experiences of those that feel subjected to these behaviors. And then looking at, like I said, we might want to deconstruct those behaviors and see, well, how are they triggering certain vulnerabilities? What can we do to really provide support based on those vulnerabilities that are being compromised? And then look at, well, how can we bring this, experience forward to help, change the behaviors in the individual that might be the aggressor. And, there are times, of course, where people have learned that this type of behavior gets them what they want, and, or creates an environment that feels most comfortable for them because they're able to maintain a level of power or exert a level of power that feels comfortable for them. And like you said, at times they might feel like these behaviors, have the best intentions to help another grow, or to see how the real world is, or to, just get past whatever roadblocks might be keeping them from, moving forward in that research development, academic development, professional development. But to kind of break down and approach the conversation where, we can hear these intentions, but we can't ignore these perceptions and these impacts. And that is more likely to come through a restorative approach rather than, maybe one of those more formal punitive approaches that we're typically more used to in our society. Does that kind of address where you're coming from, Hazel?
Wow, Bryan, thank you. That's outstanding. That's an outstanding landscape for us to be thinking about. Thank you.
Yeah. And there's times where these maybe need to work in parallel with each other, especially when we have those situations where, these behaviors are consistent or recur, often. There are then approaches we can take to, limit access to, like for a faculty member, to limit their access to students, or to, raise opportunities for students to talk about experiences with professors, or to, integrate, different levels of assessment into the tenure process and promotion process. So, there are times when those are necessary to kind of say, these will not be tolerated. But I believe in, at least my philosophy is going forward with a restorative approach is likely the first level of intervention that should be taken. So as we consider what might be helpful to mitigate these concerns, we must know the institutional resources for support. And as I prepared for this session, I reached out to two wonderful resources that you have available in your community, and those are your ombuds. And we had a great conversation, Diane and Kimberly and I, and they really helped me kind of craft this slide to share with you all about the various resources for support that you may go to if either you feel targeted, or somebody came to you and has expressed that they've been targeted by these types of behaviors. One, there's a counseling center, and I was really excited to see this is something that we are currently in the talks with about providing for our community, but that you have a counseling center, and then you even have this Find at Northeastern, which provides 24/7 telehealth. You have, of course, your EAP offices, your human resources offices, your offices for equity and access, both the equity and compliance office and the office for diversity, equity, and inclusion. My understanding is equity and compliance is more that investigative, formal arena to address some situations. And then the Office for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion really is there to help educate and gain awareness about how people can be included and in this community. You have a resource, a third-party resource, Ethics Point, which allows you to submit any concerns that you have electronically to a third party that is meant to help alleviate any fear for direct retaliation, kind of a whistleblower type mechanism. And then, of course, you have your ombuds offices. And these are wonderful resources. Diane Levin, who is the faculty and staff ombuds, and I saw some comments about the wonderful work she's provided for your community already. And then you have Kimberly Wong, who is there to support the graduate student community. And, you know, this is an opportunity for me to plug the role that I provide for my campus and that Diane and Kimberly provide for you here. And, you know, first and foremost, anyone who practices as an ombuds in any institution who provides this role to their community agrees to the standards of practice listed on this slide. And these standards of practice really can help ombuds or position ombuds well to be a great place to start when these types of situations arise, whether you're a leader, a faculty member that is informed about these types of behaviors, or you're somebody that is experiencing these behaviors yourself. So I just want to throw another poll out there to get your familiarity with the role of an ombuds. You know, what is your familiarity of the ombuds role at your institution? We have, I'm familiar with this role and I've utilized the resource, familiar with this role, but have not yet utilized the resource, heard about this role in our institution, but am unfamiliar with what it entails, or I have never heard of the role before this conversation. All right, thank you. Looks like we hit the end that we were looking for there, and I will share the results. And I am really glad to see that over half of you have already or are familiar with this role. Some of you, some haven't. Some, you know, have heard of this role, but might not be familiar. And it's a good sign for me that only a small number of you have never heard of this role. You know, that's one of the, in my role as an ombuds, it's one of the things that I'm constantly doing, is going out there and messaging to ensure that people know what this resource is, especially since we have such a strange title. And we work with conflict, which many people in our conflict avoidance society like to, you know, not think about when they are in their workplace. So get the poll out of there. There we go. As an ombuds, you know, I'll talk a little bit more about, you know, what it is that we can do to assist those in these situations. Well, one, we can help identify appropriate allies for the target. Of course, we can encourage and model self-care. You know, at times we can bring parties together for mediated conversations where there's, you know, an opportunity for everyone to feel like their perceptions are heard. And that can really be a meaningful opportunity to help, especially in those areas where, you know, maybe you have an accidental bully that intentions are not congruent with the perceptions of those behaviors. You know, we can help the target change the environment. Sometimes that's what it takes. You know, maybe this is not the right environment for the individual, whether it's a, you know, the institution, the work team, the lab, but there are usually options that we can take if it's seen that just the styles and personalities are completely incongruent. And we can also work with the aggressor to make sure that they understand the impact their behaviors are having on people and guide them to the available resources to help facilitate change in their behavior. And now let's take a look. This is kind of what we're here for, is what can we do? You know, when either we're experiencing or maybe we're observing others that, you know, might be experiencing academic bullying. So let's start for those that might feel that they are experiencing or targeted by academic bullying. You know, first and foremost, identify support. You know, look for allies within your community. You know, one of the things, like I said already, the most detrimental outcomes of bullying behavior is when people start to internalize it and start to feel like they're on their own or like everybody's against them. You know, we need to do what we can to ensure that there are allies for all individuals within our community. We need to help, or they need to identify, you know, what are the appropriate higher levels of authority. You know, it is very easy to see like some individuals in higher ed might appear that there is no level of authority that is, you know, responsible for how they behave, but that's not true. You know, everybody, you know, answers to someone, even all the way up to the presidents or chancellors. They still also have you know, boards and, you know, advisory committees that are able to, you know, provide them feedback about the way that they are behaving. You know, maybe there's a platform to anonymously report concerns. You have ethics point there. You know, in my institution, I've created a Qualtrics form that only comes to my office as an ombuds that allows people to, you know, anonymously submit what they're experiencing. And if they would like for me to reach out to them to talk about how to address it, they can provide their information at that point. And then also, you know, go to your ombuds person or another neutral third party that may be able to help navigate a path forward. And then second, once you've identified the support that's available for yourself, take care of yourself. You know, find outlets to reduce stress. Look for opportunities to build professional networks and allies outside of your immediate work team. Look at strengthening your identity outside of work, and that's hard to do. We spend so much of our time immersed in our work, but we need to be careful that we do not put all of our identity into that one basket. And then also consider support from mental health professionals. And I know that's hard for some people, but you know, there's just so much you can gain from just sharing your experience with somebody that can listen to it and then help you work through what it takes to give yourself the mental strength to work through these situations effectively. So what can we do as a bystander? You know, our goal with these efforts are to provide the upstander role that I described earlier. The hope is to provide support for the target in a way that does not compromise the situation further. Following through with these efforts can start to change the sense in our communities that hostile behaviors are unnoticed or acceptable to, you know, an assumption that these behaviors are not tolerated in our communities. You know, what can we do in the moment? One is first acknowledge. If you feel uncomfortable about a situation that is occurring and you are witnessing behavior that qualifies as bullying, first recognize it as that. You know, and this has to be internal, it doesn't have to be outward, but at least internally give presence to that observation. And then what you can do, and this can either be in the moment if you feel it's an appropriate time to do so, or even after the situation, you know, reach out to the target. Ask them, you know, a simple way to do this could be, you know, I was in this meeting today, you know, I just felt, you know, it felt uncomfortable for me. I felt that maybe, you know, you were being targeted with these behaviors that to me didn't seem appropriate. You know, how did they make you feel? And how can I support you, you know, if these made you feel uncomfortable? You know, right there can do so much just to shift the dynamics and shift the mentality or mindset that individual might be feeling at that moment. And there's also opportunities, you know, maybe you can shut down the bullying behaviors in group situations. Some interventions don't have to be so overt, you know, simply changing the subject or providing opportunities to praise an individual that you feel might be targeted, or simply saying, I'm not going, you know, if it's in that mobbing or, you know, ridiculing type of behavior, you know, just saying this does not feel good to me and I'm not gonna participate in this. So there are ways that you can, in the moment, shut down those behaviors as well. Follow-up action. So I already talked about, you know, how to reach out to the target of the bullying behavior. You know, sometimes if appropriate, you know, speak to the aggressor in private about their behavior. You know, maybe we feel like well, the power differential isn't as great between us. Maybe we have a different type of relationship with this individual, where we can really go and say, did you, this felt uncomfortable for me. Were you meaning to treat this individual in this way? And that can be a wonderful opportunity to really, help that individual understand that those behaviors are being noticed. Know the resources available for the target and yourself. And, if you feel like this is a situation that's not being addressed, take time to submit a report via your institution's reporting channels. And then also, what can we do as a leader? Directly listen and empathize to those that come and talk to you about the situations that they're experiencing. You might believe like, well, maybe they're not, they're losing sight of the intentions for these behaviors, or maybe they're perceiving these behaviors incorrectly. But, at this moment, this is how they're feeling. And you can't tell somebody that's not how they're feeling. So you can at least empathize and give space for those emotions and those feelings that they're feeling, and ask, what would it be like to feel supported in this situation? And then 2, have consistent responses to complaints. So if, individuals are coming to you, make sure that you do give everybody the opportunity for one to voice their concerns, and then be clear about what you can do, and what, whether it's observing, or, what would be helpful for them if they want you to engage in dialogue with another individual. But try to be consistent so that you can show that you really truly are an ally and support structure for individuals that are experiencing these behaviors. And then also, think about how you can integrate the right type of behaviors, those aspects of what we want to prop up in our community, into the annual review process as well. And that can really then make people, in tune to what it is that's going to be important for them to, achieve and exhibit in terms of their behaviors, so that they can make the progression in their career that they want to make. Indirectly, what can we do? Well, set expectations for conduct. So make sure it's clear what type of guiding principles are in this community. What are the ethical standards that we have for members of our faculty, our administration, our students, and really make sure that those expectations are set and known by the rest of the community. Integrate this type of awareness into the recruiting process. So when you are looking at candidates to come as students, faculty, administrators, make sure that you are seeing how they relate relationally to one another.
There was a question in the chat about that exact topic. I think Amy Lou, you had a question about identifying potential bullies during hiring.
Yeah, sorry, I'm a little bit under the weather today, so I'm not gonna turn on the video. I'm just wondering, for us, when we are doing the hiring, either hiring our peers or professors or postdocs and graduate students, if there are any kind of potential resources that would help us to, just smell it during the interview process before having someone in, because it's a lot difficult to, get someone out until, they really made some big mistakes, or to deal with them. It's great to have the resources, but also I just felt, if we can just smell the sense and then make sure that not to include those kind of negative influence into our group, perhaps we can also minimize the damage preemptively.
Yeah, that's a good question. And in terms of resources, I will have to look into that. But I mean, I guess, there's a balance. I mean, if you were to outwardly and say, how do you relate to other individuals, you're going to get, of course, the glossy answers. But you can set up, the recruiting process to really put people in situations that can give you a sense of how they relate interpersonally to others. So provide opportunities for various levels of hierarchy that are stakeholders with this recruitment process to engage with the individuals. So you can get a sense, well, how are they relating to people up and down the ladder of hierarchy. You know, find ways that you can ask them, you know, indirectly maybe about how they would respond to certain situations, and what, you know, ways that they would you know, relate, how they would relate to individuals in certain situations. So, you know, I don't have, you know, the specific guidelines around this, but just some general approaches that might be taken to help, you know, understand how people relate interpersonally within that recruitment process. So yeah, thank you, Ingrid, for asking that. And then finally, you know, we need to integrate training. You know, here at Virginia Tech, we've understood one great way to kind of help faculty members get better at working with students is to provide mentoring training. And, you know, I think that can go a long way to provide those models or varying models for how you mentor and how you adapt your mentoring style to the individuals that you might be engaged with. Trouble with training, of course, in academia is, you know, it's easy to get individuals on their way into a community, and pre-tenure, it's a little bit harder to get the engagement and buy-in from those that are already settled in their ways, and without creating defensiveness or resistance to that. But I think that should not deter us from doing what we can to get people to engage in this level of training. And I see a question here: how do you incentivize your more recalcitrant faculty to participate? We talk about that all the time, is because we recognize that, you know, it's not generally the new faculty that we're worried about. It's these individuals that have just worked in this way for so long, and that's just, you know, kind of the way that their personality is and their behavior is. But there are, you know, even if somebody is tenured and already at full professor, there are still things they want. You know, you can tie in their ability to get, you know, new resources, like, you know, the laptops. I know for our faculty, for them to qualify to get early upgrades in their laptops, they have to fulfill so many hours of training around pedagogy. And, you know, we're thinking about also incorporating some of this mentoring training as well. But yeah, I think it's important to kind of think, well, what are incentives that would work within your community? You know, that's that. You know, what are your thoughts there? You know, we have a lot of faculty members on the line here. What would incentivize you to go to further training? And I guess I ask that, then recognize, well,
we are here.
faculty members that are engaged in this, so that might
With
be
no incentive.
the wrong group to be asking this, but you know your colleagues. What do you think would help?
Food.
Food. That's always an easy one. You're meeting that basic need for food.
Bryan, I think that's a really hard question, because, as I say, you're kind of preaching to the choir here. We've stepped up to take this training. And I guess, you know, for me, it's about growing as a colleague and growing as a leader, but also helping me develop the tools and the skills that will mitigate my stress levels when I come across a new situation or a hostile situation. And I think I would, maybe not all my colleagues would recognize that, but everybody feels stress at some times, and confrontation is stressful and difficult conversations are stressful. So I guess it is about opening that space to say everyone's going to benefit from this, even if you don't feel you will. How do you make that space? And I think sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's really hard to get people to engage.
Yeah, and we have to recognize that everybody is overwhelmed, especially after 2 years of working through this pandemic. You know, the role pressures seem to only have escalated through this experience. So what can we do to encourage people to take the time to engage in this type of training? And that I think is an internal reflection for your community, and really looking at what is possible. Well, if you think about this and kind of looking at what, as a community at the higher level leadership, what are some actions that you can take in your environment to help disrupt or reduce academic bullying?
Well, I don't know if this really solves the problem, but one thing I do is I'll encourage people that are more vulnerable than I am to bring their concerns to me, and then I'll voice the concern. So even if it's not if it's just about interacting with somebody they find very difficult to interact with, it's not a, they just want to bring up a concern, but they don't want to bring up a concern directly to the person because they might get really negative pushback. I'll just bring up the concern for them. So you can, if you're in a position of strength, you can put yourself in the way, to protect people that are more vulnerable than you.
Yeah, I love that, Erin. And that's in my role as an ombuds, being that bridge over, a communication gap is often what I do. And of course, I've been trained in communication and psychology, and can work the reframing effectively. So I can try to approach individuals non-defensively, but sometimes that's what it takes, because it is, when an individual, when they are experiencing this situation, finally musters up the confidence to confront it, sometimes they don't have the skills or ability to do so in a constructive way. So I'm really glad to hear that you're able to help provide that bridge as well. Oh, Julian, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, hi, thank you. One of the things so it's not something that I do, is something that we had proposed and we had started doing when I was at UCI as a postdoc, was not geared specifically toward bullying, but I feel it could help. We felt that as a graduate student, you have a committee that you can go to. So if you're having issues with your PI, you have that resource of those other professors that hopefully are close enough to you and that you can trust on them, so that, or build some trust with them so that you can access them. But we felt that as a postdoc, you didn't have any resource like that. So what we launched was, or we proposed, and it was in the midst of being done when I left, a system of co-mentoring or for postdocs, where the postdoc has its own PI where he's working in the lab, but also has a co-mentor and some other PI that might or might not be directly on the field, but that can give them other perspectives that are outside of what the PI can provide. And establishing a system like that could potentially provide an external assistance, another place for the postdoc to have some dialogue, that if some bullying occurs, this could be another person that they could access to. It's something that occurred to me as we were talking.
I love that, Julian. And postdocs are a group, and we're really trying hard here to think about ways that we can support postdocs better, because they are a group that often does not see themselves as having the level of resources that other stakeholders in our community might have. And that's a great way to kind of do it. Like, so they have their PI that is employing them, but what other type of, mentor can they gain within the greater academic community at Northeastern? And it makes me think of a effort that was, I can't remember if it was North Carolina, University of North Carolina, or Duke, one of those two colleges started a program within their graduate school community where the students have their committee with their chair, who is helping them get through the research aspect of their PhD, their doctorate. But then also they were set up, just kind of like you were saying, with a mentor outside of that committee, just so they had another voice to talk about their greater academic and professional development. Because often those conversations with the chair tend to kind of go in the direction that fulfills the needs of that chair. Not saying all faculty are like that, but often that is kind of the direction that is given. So having this alternative opportunity to talk about academic and professional development really provides another ally for them throughout their time. So, that's what I had here. I open up for any questions, thoughts, or feedback on this conversation. I also have this case study, and I'm looking, we have about 5 minutes. This is something that I wanted to see if we had time we could go through, but this is an experience within a graduate student's, this is a situation within a graduate student's experience that, was conveyed in my office as feeling bullied. And I wanted to kind of just present this to you to see, how would you respond to this? So I'll just read through it really quickly. We have an international PhD student coming directly from their undergrad. They actually followed their undergraduate advisor to this new institution with the promise of support. The student's undergrad degree is in a related but slightly different field. Upon coming here, the advisor seems overwhelmed in the new role, and engagement is limited while the demands on your work are escalated. The student is also unhappy with the new research focus of the PhD. However, when this is brought up with the advisor, they are told to get on board and up to speed, or they will be dropped from the lab. The student does their best by spending nearly 10 hours a day in the lab. When engagement does happen, the advisor is short and often hostile. In the occasional lab meetings, your requests for guidance are chided, and you are used as a public example of a languishing graduate student. So ultimately, the student feels isolated, misled, taken advantage of, and bullied by this faculty member. So thinking of that scenario, given your role as a faculty member or administrator, how would you respond to this situation that is brought to your attention by the individual experiencing this behaviors? As an observer of this situation, maybe a colleague of the faculty member, or maybe a co-PI in a lab, or by someone who was initially approached by that target? The secondary question to consider: what institutional policies or guidelines would help inform your response? And then, this is a very important question: what structures or support resources could really help you feel most confident in your response? So as we close out this conversation, anybody that would like to kind of give your thoughts on this, I invite, or at least, this is something to kind of take away as a real life example of, what would I do in this situation? Dr. Mundell?
Bryan, I think it's clear from this example there are many pressures, and
Yeah.
I guess it depends on our institutional role. If I'm a head of department, then I have a responsibility that's within my role. If I'm a colleague or a friend, I guess it's about speaking to both parties, but understanding the new staff members' pressures, because they clearly are in a situation that's very pressured, and then seeing how to support each of the individuals. But first of all, as I say, making sure that the student has a safe place, I think, to be able to decompress is probably the first step. And then trying to see what support can be brought, or who the right people are to try to take some of the pressures off there. Is it resource, is it time, or is it perception? Because coming new into somewhere, you maybe want to be a success, and maybe that's very difficult because you've been transplanted from somewhere where you had support structures. So I think looking at it from a positive perspective, it's people who are hurting, who want to do a good job, and maybe that pressure is so great that they're not managing to do that together, but ultimately they should be able to work well together. So I think taking it down the stream, if you're unable to open that conversation up or understand what the pressures are, then I think it becomes a bit more complex. But I think, as we discussed earlier on in this session, there's also an opportunity for that student to be networked outside of that lab. I think that is one of the other critical points there, so that they have, a sanity check, that it's not them and they're not internalizing that, because that can last through a career.
Yeah. I think that's a great, spectrum of responses there, and really, what what it would take. You know, maybe the faculty member under all these role pressures does not identify. You know, maybe they felt comfortable and secure in the relationship with the student that, you know, they feel like they can act this way and that student can get on board. But obviously there's a disconnect there. So what can we do to create dialogue? I saw someone else's, you know, maybe this environment isn't the right place. You know, it's not the right field, but, you know, you're at a university with many faculty members and disciplines that might relate well. Is there another environment that the student could get into? Thank you. Just kind of looking through some of the chat here.
Yeah, and I'm aware that many people will probably need to go because we're bumping up against the hour. So I just want to ask you all to join me in thanking Dr. Hanson for leading this really valuable discussion. We can do the Zoom, the weird Zoom clap. And I put a link to an evaluation form. We'd love your feedback. And also, this is the first of a series of 4 discussions on this topic. So please join us for the other 3, the next of which is Thursday from 2 to 3:30 with Dr. Leah Hollis. So thank you again very much, Bryan, for this conversation.
Yeah, so I'll leave you with those things to think about and to carry forward in these next conversations. I'm really glad, like I said, that you guys are having this series. It's absolutely wonderful to see, and I appreciate my opportunity to contribute to it. So, you know, good luck, and, you know, anytime I can be helpful, feel free to reach out. I know Randall's got my contact information.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.